In a quiet fishing village by the sea, a young woman named Elira lives a peaceful life with her father, a man who has long since hidden from the world he once ruled. But when a group of outlaws arrives, threatening her and her family, they do not realize who her father truly is, the most feared swordsman in the kingdom. What begins as a cruel act of harassment quickly escalates, as the outlaws soon learn that the fisherman's daughter is protected by a man whose name has terrified kingdoms. This is the story of how a quiet village and a long-forgotten hero are thrust into a battle they never saw coming. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button for our YouTube channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming stories. Your support truly helps us share these hard-hitting stories with more people. The sun dipped low over the horizon, casting a golden glow over the small fishing village nestled against the rugged coastline. Waves lapped gently at the shore, the rhythmic sound soothing the village's inhabitants after another day's work. The air smelled of salt and brine, the familiar scent of fish and seaweed, of hard work and honest living. Life in the village was simple, but for Elira, the daughter of the village fisherman, it was all she had ever known. She walked along the docks, the soles of her worn boots pressing into the weathered wood. Her father's small boat was tethered to the pier, his nets laid out in neat rows as he prepared for another early morning of fishing. Elira had learned the trade from him, her hands steady as she worked the nets, her eyes always scanning the horizon for signs of the weather turning. It was a life that was predictable, comforting in its simplicity, but Elira couldn't deny that there was something stirring inside her. A yearning for more than the endless cycle of work, the quiet days and nights spent with only the sound of the ocean to keep her company. As she made her way home, she glanced toward the cliffs in the distance, the dark shapes of the mountains standing tall against the fading sky. But before she could lose herself in her thoughts, she heard footsteps behind her, light but deliberate. Her heart skipped a beat, and her senses sharpened. The villagers were a close-knit group, and strangers didn't often pass through. She turned just in time to see a group of men approaching, their faces hidden beneath rough cloaks, their gait uneven, almost predatory. At first, Elira thought little of it. Outlaws were not uncommon on the outskirts of the kingdom, but they usually kept their distance. But as the men drew closer, she could feel the tension in the air, the hair on the back of her neck rising. Something about their presence felt wrong. One of them, a man with a scar across his cheek, stepped forward with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. His companions lingered behind him, their eyes dark and calculating. "Ah, the fisherman's daughter," the scarred man said, his voice low, dripping with mockery. "Out for a walk, are we?" Elira froze, her pulse quickening. She had heard stories of outlaws harassing the villages along the coast, but she had never expected them to come so close to her home. She kept her gaze steady, her voice firm, though the unease in her chest had begun to swell. "Leave me be," Elira said, her voice cold, but with an edge that betrayed the uncertainty she felt. "I'm not interested in whatever it is you want." The scarred man laughed, the sound harsh in the silence of the evening. "Oh, we're not here to offer you anything, sweetheart," he sneered. "We're just here for a bit of fun." Elira's heart sank. She had heard tales of what these men did, how they tormented those who were weaker, how they terrorized villages like hers without fear of retribution. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly guess, was that she was not alone. Her father had always kept to himself, his past a mystery even to most of the villagers. But Elira knew the truth. She knew that the quiet fisherman who spent his days mending nets and fishing in the sea was no ordinary man. She had heard the stories when she was younger, the tales of a swordsman so fierce, so feared, that even the king had called upon him to protect the realm. Her father had once been a member of the King's Guard, a legendary warrior whose skill with a blade was unmatched. But after the battles, after the bloodshed, her father had left it all behind. He had come to the village seeking peace, seeking a life far removed from the violence that had defined his youth. And Elira had grown up with a man who was quiet, humble, and kind, never speaking of his past, never lifting his sword in anger. But she knew that beneath the quiet surface, there was still the heart of the greatest swordsman the kingdom had ever known. And if these men threatened her, If they pushed too far, they would learn the truth. The scarred man took a step forward, his grin widening. "What's wrong, girl? Cat got your tongue? Maybe we'll have a little fun with you, just to pass the time." Elira's pulse quickened, and she felt the familiar knot of fear tighten in her stomach. She was alone. She was far from her father, and the village was quiet. There would be no one to hear her if she cried out, but she couldn't show them fear. She had to remain strong, even if the odds were stacked against her. Without a word, she turned to walk away, her steps deliberate but calm, her eyes scanning the men out of the corner of her vision. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of knowing she was afraid. But then, she heard the scarred man's voice again, this time sharper, filled with malice. "Where do you think you're going, girl? You don't get to walk away from us that easily." Elira's heart raced, her feet moving faster now. She knew she couldn't outrun them. They were too close. She had to find a way to turn the tables. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something. A movement in the distance, a figure stepping out of the shadows at the edge of the docks. Her breath caught in her throat as the figure grew clearer, and she recognized the familiar, imposing silhouette of her father. His broad shoulders were framed by the setting sun, and in his hands, he held a large, weathered sword. The weapon of a man who had long since left his past behind but had never truly forgotten how to wield it. The outlaws hadn't noticed him yet, and Elira felt a rush of both fear and relief flood her chest. This was it. They had pushed too far. Her father's voice rang out, low and steady, but filled with an undeniable authority. "Leave my daughter alone." The outlaws froze, their expressions faltering as they turned to face the man who had appeared behind them, the man they had so foolishly underestimated. Elira felt a surge of strength fill her chest as she looked at the outlaws, watching as their bravado crumbled. Her father's sword gleamed in the fading light, a promise of what was to come. The outlaws turned slowly, their eyes widening as they locked onto the figure standing tall behind Elira. Her father's presence filled the space between them, filling the air with a palpable tension that seemed to tighten the very atmosphere. The man who had once been a legendary sword fighter in the King's Guard, long thought to have disappeared from the world of blood and battle, was standing before them, his posture still that of a soldier, his sword gleaming with the promise of death if they dared make a move. Elira's heart raced as she stood motionless, her breath shallow in her chest. She could see the outlaws' uncertainty begin to surface, the cocky bravado they had displayed earlier slipping away like water through a cracked dam. The scarred man, who had been so eager to intimidate her moments before, now looked unsure, his eyes darting between Elira and her father. "You," the scarred man began, his voice faltering, but he quickly regained his composure. He sneered, trying to regain control of the situation. "You're just some old fisherman. What's this? You think you can threaten us with a rusty sword?" Her father did not answer immediately, but his grip on the hilt of his blade tightened. His gaze was unyielding, his face a mask of calm, but there was a fierce, dangerous energy radiating from him, one that Elira had witnessed in her childhood but had not seen in years. It was the energy of the man who had once brought kings to their knees, the man who had carved his name into the annals of the kingdom's history with nothing but his blade. "You should have left," Jethro finally said, his voice low but full of authority. "You had your chance. Now you'll see why I was once feared." The scarred man's face twisted with both disbelief and arrogance. He reached for his sword, but Elira could see that it was an empty gesture, one born from desperation rather than confidence. He was no match for the man who stood before him, and deep down, he knew it. But still, he couldn't let go of his pride. "We'll see about that, fisherman," he spat, drawing his sword with a rough motion. In an instant, the tension snapped. The scarred man lunged forward, his sword aimed at her father's chest with reckless fury. But Jethro's movements were fluid, graceful, a perfect blend of skill and instinct. He stepped aside with the ease of a man who had faced 1,000 battles, and in one swift, controlled motion, he disarmed the outlaw, sending the man's sword flying from his grip. The sound of the sword hitting the ground was a harsh reminder of who they were dealing with. Jethro's blade was still raised, its tip hovering just inches from the man's throat. The other outlaws froze, their faces pale as they watched the leader's defeat. Elira's heart pounded in her chest as she watched her father, but there was no fear in her. There was only a strange, sharp sense of pride. This man, her father, was still the warrior he had once been. Despite the years spent hidden away from the world of battle, the scarred man, now on his knees, was panting heavily, his hands shaking as they rose in surrender. You're Jethro," he gasped, the realization dawning on him. "The King's Guard. I've heard the stories. But you're just a fisher. You made a mistake," Jethro replied, his voice cold, his eyes unwavering. "You thought I was weak because I've chosen a different life. You thought wrong." The outlaws around him hesitated. They were a rough, unruly group, used to intimidating those weaker than themselves. But they now found themselves facing something far beyond their understanding. The fear in their eyes was palpable. "Elira," Jethro said without turning his head, his voice steady. "Get inside. Now." Elira nodded, her feet moving before her mind could even catch up with the order. She wanted to stay by her father's side, to witness the confrontation unfold, but she knew better than to argue. She was not part of this world. She had only seen glimpses of it in her youth, and now it was a world that she could never fully understand. With one last glance at her father, who stood unwavering, the embodiment of quiet power, she turned and hurried toward their small cottage, her heart still racing. She could feel the heat of the confrontation behind her, could hear the mutterings of the outlaws, but she didn't dare look back. Inside the cottage, she waited, her hands clenched into fists, her breath shallow as she strained to hear what was happening outside. The minutes stretched long, each one stretching the tension tighter inside her. But she could hear her father's voice once again, his words low and firm. "I won't warn you again," Jethro said. The next few moments were filled with the quiet crackle of the wind outside, and then silence. A deep, tense silence. Elira held her breath, waiting for any sign of movement, any sound that would tell her whether her father had won. And then, as she stood by the window, her heart pounding in her chest, the door to the cottage swung open. Jethro walked in, his expression calm but serious. His clothes were stained with dirt and sweat, his sword still gripped tightly in his hand, but there was no blood on him, not a single mark on his skin. "They're gone," he said, his voice carrying an unspoken weight. Elira released the breath she hadn't known she was holding. She felt a strange, unspoken connection with her father in that moment. She had always known that her father had a past, but she had never truly understood what that past had been. Now, in the quiet aftermath of the confrontation, she could feel the difference. The world they had lived in, her father, the fisherman, and her, had changed. The calm, simple life they had made by the sea was no longer enough to shield them. "We'll be ready for the next time," Jethro added, sheathing his sword. "They won't come back here unprepared again." Elira nodded, a sense of resolve settling within her. She didn't know what would come next, but one thing was certain. Her father was not just the quiet fisherman she had always known. He was a force, a man who had lived through wars, battles, and kingdoms. And now, those outlaws had learned who he truly was. The days after the outlaws' retreat were quieter, but the tension that lingered in the air was unmistakable. Elira could feel it in the way her father moved, the way he would glance toward the horizon when he thought she wasn't looking, his posture stiff and unyielding. She knew he was preparing for the next attack, and she couldn't blame him. These men, these outlaws, had shown their hand. They had tested him, underestimated him, and they would likely return. Perhaps with greater numbers, perhaps with more ferocity. And yet, in the days that followed, nothing happened. The outlaws never returned. The village settled back into its quiet rhythm, with only the occasional rustle of the wind or the soft thrum of the sea to break the silence. It almost felt like nothing had changed, as though the confrontation had been nothing more than a bad dream. The docks were bustling with the same sense of normalcy, and Elira found herself returning to her duties without thinking much of it. But then, one evening, as the sky deepened into twilight, Elira stood at the edge of the docks, watching the horizon, her hands idly tracing the edge of her father's nets. The sea was calm, the last remnants of sunlight casting a soft golden glow across the water. And yet, there was a deep unease gnawing at her. She didn't know why it was happening now, why the worry had suddenly returned. Perhaps it was the stillness of the evening, the quiet that had settled over the village. Perhaps it was because, for the first time in a long while, Elira felt the presence of something lurking, something that wasn't quite right. Elira, her father's voice, low and commanding, broke her out of her thoughts. She turned to see him standing behind her, his figure silhouetted by the fading light. His expression was unreadable, but she saw the subtle shift in his posture. It was a change she had learned to read over the years, the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his hands rested near the hilt of his sword. "Are you all right?" Jethro asked. Elira nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She glanced toward the sea, as if searching for something, but the horizon remained calm, unbroken. "I'm fine, Father," she said, her voice steady, though her heart beat faster than usual. "It's just, I can't shake the feeling that something's coming." Jethro didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped beside her, his gaze shifting to the distant cliffs where the village lay tucked in the shadows. He stood there for a moment, the wind tugging at his weathered cloak, his eyes scanning the land as though looking for something that was just out of view. His silence was more telling than words. "We've had peace for too long," Elira said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. She didn't need to explain. Her father had seen it all, the wars, the bloodshed, the betrayals. She didn't need to tell him what she was feeling. He understood. "You're right," he said after a long pause. "Peace is often the calm before a storm. And the outlaws, they won't give up. They're like wolves, always circling, waiting for the right moment to strike." Elira turned to him, meeting his gaze. Her father's eyes were distant, filled with a weariness that spoke of battles fought long ago. But there was no fear in him. There never had been. He was a man forged by war, tempered by years of violence. But now, in the quiet of their village, he was a man on edge. She saw it in the way his fingers brushed the hilt of his sword, the way his shoulders remained tense. "They'll come back, won't they?" she asked softly. Jethro didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced at the path leading away from the village. His expression darkened, and Elira could see the lines on his face deepen with the weight of unspoken thoughts. "Yes," he finally said, his voice low but resolute. "They'll come back, and when they do, we'll be ready." Elira didn't say anything more, but the weight of his words settled heavily on her shoulders. She understood the implications. They had been living in a fragile peace, one that had been broken only briefly by the outlaws. But that was only the beginning. The world was changing, and her father, her once legendary father, was preparing for another battle. The following days were filled with an uneasy quiet. Her father, though he continued his work at the docks, kept to himself more than usual. He sharpened his sword, prepared his old armor, and spent long hours staring out at the sea, as if waiting for the inevitable. Elira, too, began to feel the pull of anticipation. She was no longer just the fisherman's daughter. She was caught in the web of a larger world, one that she had always been protected from. One afternoon, as the village went about its business, Elira saw something she hadn't expected. A small group of travelers on horseback approaching from the east. They were dressed in rough clothing, their faces shadowed by cloaks, but the way they moved, the way their horses trotted with purpose, told her everything she needed to know. "They're here," Elira whispered to herself, her heart sinking in her chest. The travelers dismounted near the village, and as they approached, Elira's gaze locked onto one of them. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and his eyes were sharp, like a predator scanning its surroundings. He was no stranger to conflict. His movements were calculated, purposeful, and there was something about him, something in the way he looked at her, that made her heart race. Elira turned toward her father, her breath catching in her throat. He had seen them too. His hand, which had rested so comfortably on his sword hilt, now gripped the blade with a firm certainty. He stepped forward, his face unreadable, his eyes narrowing as he took in the figures approaching. "We may have company," Jethro said, his voice cold and steady. Elira nodded, her body tensing as the group of strangers grew closer. She had always trusted her father, had always felt safe with him by her side, but she knew deep down that the danger was real. It had arrived at their doorstep, and there was no turning away from it. The leader of the group stepped forward, his eyes locking with Jethro's. His smile was tight, like a wolf preparing for a hunt. "You," the man said with a sneer, his voice low and menacing. "You're the one they call Jethro, the king's sword, the man who vanished." Jethro said nothing, but Elira could feel the weight of his silence. The tension between them grew thick, as though the world had shifted once again. And then the man's smile widened. "We've heard stories about you," the man continued, "but now, it's time for you to learn what happens when you disappear from the world. You and your daughter will come with us, or we'll make you." Elira's blood ran cold as she felt the sharp edge of danger close in around them. Elira's heart hammered in her chest as the stranger's words hung in the air. The tension that had been building inside her now erupted in a flash of adrenaline. She had heard of men like this, the kind who preyed on villages, on people like her father, thinking they could control everything with their threats. But Elira had never been more certain of one thing in her life. These men had no idea who they were dealing with. She stole a quick glance at her father, who stood motionless, his back straight and his gaze unyielding. Jethro's hand, still resting on the hilt of his sword, tightened ever so slightly, and Elira knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that he was ready. He wasn't going to let them take her. He wasn't going to let anyone take anything from them, not after everything they had already sacrificed. The man who had spoken, tall, broad-shouldered, with a jagged scar running down his cheek, took another step forward, a menacing grin spreading across his face. "You're the last of your kind, Jethro, the kingdom's greatest swordsman, hiding in a little fishing village. No one ever told me that the lion had become a lamb." Elira's breath caught in her throat. The words stung, but it wasn't the insult that bothered her. It was the recognition, the realization that these men had been tracking her father, had been seeking him out for a reason. Whatever they wanted, whatever they planned, it was clear that it had to do with Jethro's past. And this time, Elira knew there would be no hiding from it. "I don't know what you want," Jethro said, his voice calm but edged with something darker. "But you're trespassing, and I won't ask again." The scarred man laughed, an ugly sound that seemed to echo in the stillness of the evening. "What we want is simple. You, the name, the legacy you've buried, and we're not leaving without it." Elira's pulse quickened as the meaning of the words sank in. These men weren't just outlaws. They were hunting something far deeper, something that had been hidden away for years. They were after her father's past, the reputation he had long since left behind when he retired to this quiet village. But the danger had caught up with them. Her father was no longer just the fisherman who mended nets and cast lines into the sea. He was the man the kingdom had once feared, the man who had held a blade with the precision of a king's guard. And that past, the one he had fought to leave behind, was coming for him. Jethro's face darkened as the men around the scarred leader began to advance, weapons drawn. They were making their move, pressing forward like wolves circling their prey. The sun had dipped behind the horizon, and the shadows of the evening stretched long across the dock, making the scene feel even more ominous. "They'll be coming for more than just me," Jethro said under his breath, his eyes narrowing with cold determination. "Elira," he added, turning toward her, his voice low but firm. "Get inside. Do not move." Elira's heart twisted in her chest at the order. She wanted to stay by his side, to fight beside him, but she knew better. Her father had made it clear for years that she was to stay out of his battles. This was one she couldn't be part of. Not yet, at least. With one last glance at him, Elira turned on her heel and sprinted toward the house, her footsteps quick and light, but her heart heavy with dread. As she reached the door, she glanced back over her shoulder, only to see the Outlaws' leader stepping forward, his expression grim and hungry. "Elira," Jethro's voice rang out, sharp with authority. "Do not look back." And with that, she pushed through the door and into the dimly lit cottage. Her mind raced. She had no weapon, no means to protect herself, but that wasn't the fear that gnawed at her now. It was the certainty that her father was about to face something far more dangerous than these outlaws had anticipated. Elira pressed herself against the wall, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The world outside seemed to shrink, the sound of the ocean crashing against the rocks now distant and muffled by the walls of their home. She couldn't bear the thought of her father out there alone with those men, but she knew there was nothing she could do. She would wait. She would trust him to handle it. But the quiet that followed felt like an eternity, and the longer she waited, the more she could feel the tension rise, until, finally, the door creaked open. Her father entered, his silhouette dark against the fading light of the evening. Elira's breath caught in her throat, and she rushed to meet him, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Father, are they gone? What happened?" Jethro didn't immediately respond. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, looked tired, like a man who had faced something he didn't wish to confront again. He stepped inside fully, closing the door behind him with a soft click. "They're gone," he said finally, his voice low, but filled with something Elira couldn't quite place. "For now. But this isn't over." The weight of his words sank like a stone in her stomach. Elira could see the change in him now, the flicker of something buried deep within his soul. A reminder that he was not just a fisherman, not just her father. He was someone else entirely. He was a man of war. A man who had walked away from the kingdom he once served, only to find that his past would never stay buried. "What do we do now?" Elira asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Jethro's gaze hardened, his jaw set with grim determination. "We prepare." Elira's chest tightened as she realized the depth of the situation. Her father's past had come knocking, and this time, it wasn't just a group of outlaws who were after them. It was something much larger, something more dangerous, and they would have to face it, head on. The quiet of the cottage felt almost oppressive after the confrontation. Elira could still hear the voices of the outlaws in her mind, their taunting words echoing through the stillness. But now, as she stood in the warmth of the home, looking at her father, a new kind of silence had descended upon them. The weight of his past was no longer something hidden away. It was now a looming shadow, casting its long fingers over the life they had built. Jethro's eyes were distant, his thoughts clearly far away, even as he moved through the small house. He had always been a man of few words, but tonight, there was an unspoken tension in the air that filled the room with a heaviness Elira couldn't ignore. "What do we prepare for?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, filled with the kind of uncertainty she hadn't known before. Her father's gaze shifted toward her, and for a moment, Elira could see something in his eyes. Something that wasn't just the steely resolve of a warrior, but the weariness of a man who had fought too many battles and had seen too much loss. "They'll be back," he said simply, his voice low and grim. "Not just them, but others. Men who know what I used to be, who remember what I did. They won't stop until they have what they came for." The words hit Elira like a blow to the chest. She had known that the outlaws hadn't been the end, but to hear her father speak of it with such certainty, such finality, sent a chill through her. Her mind raced, images of their small village being overrun, the streets filled with violence, her father forced to draw his sword again, to step back into a life he had long since abandoned. She stepped toward him, her hands trembling slightly, but she steadied herself. "What did they want, father? Why did they come for you?" Jethro took a slow breath, his eyes flickering with a momentary hesitation before he spoke. "They're after more than just me. They want the name, the legacy. They believe that if they can drag me back into that life, into the world of the Kingsguard, they can use me as a weapon. They think I can help them conquer something. Something bigger than this village, bigger than me." Elira's heart pounded in her chest. The thought of her father, the man who had kept to himself for so many years, suddenly being thrust back into that world of blood and power, was almost too much to bear. She had grown up with him as a quiet figure, a man who had traded his sword for a simple life by the sea. And now, that life was being torn apart by forces she could barely understand. "But why now?" Elira asked, struggling to wrap her mind around it. "Why come for you after all these years?" Jethro sighed. looking down at the sword he had leaned against the wall earlier. His fingers brushed over the worn leather hilt, and for a moment, Elira could see the conflict in his eyes. The old soldier, the warrior, warring with the man who had chosen peace. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I thought I had left that life behind. I thought I had earned my peace. But the world doesn't forget, Elira. It doesn't forgive. And my past, no matter how far I ran from it, has a way of coming back to me." Elira swallowed hard, the knot in her stomach tightening. She had always known that her father's past was something he would never talk about in detail. There had been whispers when she was a child, rumors about his time with the King's Guard, about the battles he had fought, the enemies he had slain, but she had never fully understood what that life meant. Now, in the face of the outlaws, she was beginning to see the cost of that hidden past. Her father's gaze met hers, and there was an intensity in his eyes that she hadn't seen in years. "You're not just my daughter anymore, Elira," he said quietly. "You're a part of this too. This isn't just my fight. The outlaws and the men who will come after them, they won't stop until they get what they want. And I won't let them take you." The weight of his words settled in Elira's chest like a stone. She had always known that her father was capable of great things, of being a great man, a protector. But now, with everything hanging in the balance, she realized how little she had truly understood about who he was and what he had been through. "We need to prepare," Jethro said, his voice hardening with a new sense of purpose. "I can't hide from this any longer. You need to learn. You need to be ready, because when they come again, we can't afford to be caught unprepared." Elira nodded, her body tense but determined. She had no choice now. She couldn't run from this. She couldn't hide. This was the world she had been born into, whether she was ready or not. Her father stood, moving toward the small chest at the foot of the bed, where he kept his old armor and weapons. He opened it slowly, as though the weight of it, of the sword, the shields, and the armor, was as heavy now as it had ever been. He pulled the sword from the chest and held it in his hands for a moment, inspecting the blade. "This is who I was," he said quietly, as if speaking more to himself than to her. "And it's who I have to be again. For us. For you." Elira felt a flicker of fear, but there was something else too. A fierce pride that welled up inside her, unbidden and unexpected. She wasn't a child anymore. She had grown up in the shadow of her father's past, and now she had to step into that shadow herself. If she was going to survive this, if she was going to protect what little they had left, she would have to face it head-on. "Teach me," Elira said, her voice steady and full of determination. "I'm ready." Jethro turned to look at her, his eyes softening for just a moment before he nodded, his face hardening once again. "You'll need to be. This is no longer a fight for just survival. This is a fight for everything we've built." The days that followed were filled with an intensity Elira had never experienced before. Each morning, as the sun began to rise, she found herself at the edge of the docks, her father beside her, teaching her everything he had once known. The ocean, once her sanctuary, had become the backdrop for her transformation. It was no longer the place of quiet, peaceful mornings spent mending nets. It was the stage where she would learn to survive, to fight, and to protect. The first lesson was simple, yet it shook Elira to her core. Jethro handed her an old, worn sword, a training weapon, blunt at the edge, but still heavy in her hands. She felt the weight of it immediately, and her arms ached from the effort of simply holding it. "Hold it steady," Jethro instructed, his voice calm but carrying the weight of years of experience. "This is not just an object. It's an extension of you. Every movement you make with it should feel natural. It should be as if it's a part of you." Elira gripped the hilt, feeling awkward and ungainly as she tried to keep the sword steady in her hands. Her father watched her with a quiet intensity, his eyes never leaving her form. There was no impatience in him, only the understanding that she had never held a blade in this way before. "Relax," he said. "You can't force the blade to move. You have to allow it. Allow it to follow your lead, to flow with your body. And remember, you never strike in anger. The sword is a tool, not a weapon for revenge." Elira nodded, though she wasn't sure she fully understood. But she was determined to try. She focused on the sword, adjusting her stance, her feet planted firmly on the ground, her body aligned in a way that felt alien and unnatural. The sword felt like a foreign entity, one she had to learn to control. Her father's gaze softened as he observed her. Good. Now, step forward. She obeyed, stepping carefully, but the moment she did, he moved with lightning speed, his own sword flashing through the air as he swept it toward her. She barely had time to react. Too slow, he said gently as the blunt edge of his sword tapped her lightly on the shoulder. Elira took a step back, startled by the speed with which her father had moved. I wasn't ready, she said, trying to hide the frustration in her voice. You're not supposed to be ready, Jethro replied. That's the point. It's not about reacting, it's about anticipating. You must move before your opponent even realizes what you're going to do. He motioned for her to try again. This time, don't just wait. Move with me. Move before me. Elira took a deep breath, her mind racing. She tightened her grip on the sword, determined to do it right this time. The next time her father moved, she didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, using the strength of her legs, anticipating his swing. As his sword came toward her, she raised her own in defense, the two blades meeting with a dull clang. It wasn't perfect, she stumbled, barely keeping her balance, but for the first time, she felt the sword connect in a way that made sense. Good, Jethro said, his voice approving. You're learning. Now, keep your focus. You must always expect the unexpected. The days blurred together as Elira continued to train. Each lesson was a lesson in patience, in precision, and in control. Her father was relentless, but never cruel. He showed her the techniques, the movements, the discipline that had once made him the fiercest swordsman in the kingdom. And with every practice, Elira felt herself growing stronger, more confident. But it wasn't just the sword that her father taught her. He taught her the other aspects of survival, the mental preparation, the ability to read the land, to listen for the slightest changes in the environment. He taught her to sharpen not just the sword, but her instincts, to look for danger even in the most peaceful of moments. The world outside was not what it seemed. There were enemies hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. One evening, after a long day of practice, Elira sat with her father at the edge of the docks, staring out at the ocean. The sky above was a deep violet, the stars beginning to twinkle like distant lanterns. The village was quiet, peaceful again, but Elira knew, deep down, that peace would not last. Father, Elira began, her voice hesitant. Do you ever regret leaving that life behind? The one in the King's Guard? Jethro didn't answer right away. Instead, he gazed out at the water, the lines of his face softened by the fading light. The quiet of the evening settled around them, broken only by the occasional creak of the dock or the gentle slap of the waves against the shore. I don't regret it, he said finally, his voice low but sure. I chose to leave because I wanted something more than the bloodshed. I wanted peace, a life where I could be more than just a sword. But sometimes, the past doesn't let you go. And when it comes knocking, you either face it or run. I'm not the kind of man who runs. Elira felt the weight of his words. He wasn't just preparing her for the fight ahead. He was preparing her for the harsh truth of life, that no matter how far you ran, the past would always find you. And when it did, you had to face it with everything you had. She turned to him, her voice filled with quiet determination. I'll be ready, Father. I won't run either. Jethro looked at her, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he were studying her. For a moment, he didn't speak. Then, with a small nod, he said, I know you will be. The training, the lessons, the long hours spent in silence, they had all led to this moment. Elira could feel the shift inside her. She was no longer just the fisherman's daughter. She was a warrior, and her father had made sure of that. The world outside was still filled with dangers she could never have imagined before, but she was ready. She wasn't afraid anymore. Elira stood, her eyes fixed on the horizon, her sword at her side. She could feel her father's presence behind her, steady, unwavering, and she knew, no matter what came next, they would face it together. We'll keep training, Jethro said, as if reading her thoughts. Until you're ready for what's coming. Elira nodded. The battle was coming, and she would be ready. The days turned into weeks, and Elira's training intensified. She had become faster, stronger, more capable with each passing day. The sword, once awkward in her hands, had become an extension of her will. She no longer hesitated when her father called for a drill, no longer struggled to lift the blade. Every movement felt natural now, every strike purposeful, every block calculated. But still, despite her progress, there was an unease that gnawed at her, a sense of impending danger she couldn't shake. Her father had made it clear. This training was not just about physical strength or skill. It was about mental preparation. He taught her to observe, to listen to the world around her, to recognize the smallest details that could mean life or death. She learned to track footsteps in the dirt, to hear the soft rustle of leaves in the wind that might betray an approaching enemy. Her senses were heightened now, sharpened by necessity, and yet the quiet of the village remained, as though it was holding its breath in anticipation. One evening, as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the village, Elira and her father were practicing their swordplay by the docks. Her father moved with a grace and precision that still amazed her, despite all she had learned. His movements were fluid, controlled, and in that moment, he seemed ageless, as though time had no power over him. She, on the other hand, was still learning, still growing. But with every strike, every maneuver, she felt herself coming into her own. Suddenly, the quiet of the evening was shattered. The sound of hooves pounding the dirt road echoed through the village, sharp and insistent. Elira's heart skipped a beat. She had learned to expect the unexpected, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. Her father's eyes flicked toward the sound, his posture shifting instantly from that of a teacher to that of a warrior. He was already moving before Elira could even ask what was happening. Without a word, he grabbed his sword from where it rested against the dock, his movements swift and purposeful. "Elira," he said, his voice low but urgent, inside. "Now." There was no time for protest. Elira's feet moved on their own as she ran toward the cottage, her mind racing with 1,000 questions. She had trained for this moment, had prepared herself for the dangers that lurked in the shadows, but the reality of it, the fear, the raw anticipation, was something she had never truly understood until now. She reached the door, but just as her hand touched the handle, her father's voice called out to her. "Elira." She turned back, her heart hammering in her chest. Her father was already standing at the edge of the docks, his posture unyielding, his eyes scanning the horizon. He was no longer the man who had spent his days in quiet solitude. He was the man he had once been, the protector, the warrior, the king's guard. And now, they were about to face whatever threat had come for them. "Elira," he repeated, his voice filled with steel, "stay inside. Lock the door." Elira hesitated for only a moment before nodding. She understood. The time for hiding was over. She closed the door behind her, but her mind refused to settle. Her father had trained her well, and she had no intention of being idle. She moved to the window, peering through the crack between the curtains. Her heart sank as she saw the group of riders approaching the village, their horses galloping toward the docks. They were dressed in dark cloaks, their faces obscured, but the way they moved, there was no mistaking it. These were not simple travelers. These were men on a mission. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized that her father's past had finally caught up with him. The outlaws had come again, but this time, they weren't just here to harass. They were here for something much bigger. They had come for him. Through the window, Elira could see her father standing alone at the edge of the docks, facing the approaching riders. He didn't move, didn't flinch, but there was a quiet intensity in the way he held his sword, the way his body was coiled, ready to strike. The riders dismounted as they reached the dock, their movements deliberate. The leader, tall and broad-shouldered, stepped forward, his eyes locking with Jethro's. There was something familiar about him, something that made Elira's blood run cold. She had seen that look before, heard that tone. "You," the leader said, his voice low and menacing. "The king's dog, the one who disappeared." Jethro's stance didn't change, but Elira could see the flicker of recognition in his eyes. He knew these men. He knew what they were here for. "I don't know what you want," Jethro said, his voice calm but filled with an undercurrent of warning. "But if you came here looking for trouble, you'll find it." The leader grinned, a cold, predatory smile. "We didn't come looking for trouble, old man. We came looking for you. You think you can hide forever? You think you can escape your past? Well, it's found you." Elira's mind raced. These men were not just common outlaws. They were a threat, a force to be reckoned with. And whatever they had planned, it was clear that her father had been their target all along. Her grip tightened on the windowsill as she watched her father prepare for what was to come. He was ready. He had always been ready. But the question remained, could they survive this? "Come on then," Jethro said, his voice filled with a quiet rage. "Let's see if you're as good as they say I am." Without another word, he stepped forward, the sword gleaming in the fading light of day. And in that moment, Elira knew this was no longer just about survival. This was about something much bigger. The storm had come, and it was ready to break over them. The tension that hung in the air was thick, suffocating. Elira's breath quickened as she watched her father face the group of riders, his body poised like a predator, ready to strike. The leader of the group, a man with a cold sneer etched across his face, stepped forward, drawing a curved sword that glinted in the fading light. His men followed suit, each one ready for battle. The ground beneath them seemed to pulse with anticipation. Elira pressed her back against the wall, her pulse roaring in her ears as she strained to hear every word, every movement. She wanted to run, to rush out to her father's side, but she knew better. Her father had always insisted that she stay out of his battles, that she never involve herself in the violence that came with his past. But she also knew that this time, the battle was different. This wasn't just a skirmish. This was something that would decide everything. The future of their lives, the future of their village, and perhaps the future of the kingdom itself. Her father's voice cut through the stillness, firm and unyielding. "You came for me," Jethro said, his eyes never leaving the leader. "And now you'll find out what happens when you threaten the wrong man." The leader's grin widened, a mix of amusement and arrogance. "The wrong man? Huh? I've heard the stories, old man. The legend of Jethro, the king's sword. But legends are nothing but stories. And you're nothing but a fisherman now. A man who's forgotten what he used to be." Elira watched her father's jaw tighten. His hand never wavered on the hilt of his sword, and she could see the quiet fury in his eyes. He didn't respond, but Elira knew him well enough to see the fury building inside him, just beneath the surface. This man, the leader of the outlaws, had no idea what he was about to unleash. "Get out of here while you can," Jethro said quietly, the calmness of his voice belying the deadly force that simmered beneath. "Leave, and you won't have to die today." The leader chuckled darkly, his men shifting in anticipation. "You really think you can scare us, old man? You've been hiding away for too long. It's time for the kingdom to remember what you used to be, and what you can still do." With a sharp, commanding motion, the leader swung his sword in a wide arc, a signal for the rest of the men to charge. Elira's heart skipped a beat as the outlaws advanced, their swords raised high. Her father didn't flinch. He didn't even seem to breathe. The moment the first outlaw came within range, Jethro moved with blinding speed, his sword flashing through the air with the precision of a master. The clash of steel against steel rang out like thunder, the force of the strikes vibrating through the ground beneath Elira's feet. Her father's sword moved effortlessly, cutting through the air, deflecting blows with ease. Each swing was fluid, calculated, a dance that had been perfected over years of battle. The outlaws seemed slow in comparison, their strikes wild, desperate. They had no idea how much they had underestimated him. The leader's eyes narrowed as he watched the fight unfold. He hadn't expected Jethro to move with such speed, with such deadly precision. His men were being cut down one by one, their blades shattering against Jethro's own, their lives snuffed out with each deadly blow. "Get him!" the leader shouted, his voice now laced with fear. But it was too late. The remaining outlaws hesitated, their confidence shattered by the sheer brutality of Jethro's skill. He moved through them like a storm, unstoppable, relentless. Elira could see it all from the window. Her father fighting, his movements swift and decisive. Every strike a promise of death for anyone who dared challenge him. For a brief moment, Elira's mind flashed back to her childhood. She had seen her father fight once before, when she was just a little girl. He had been unstoppable then, too, but she hadn't understood the full weight of it. The fear that came with such power, the responsibility that came with being the greatest swordsman in the kingdom. Her father had stepped away from that life, buried it beneath the simple existence of a fisherman. But now, that life had come rushing back, and it was as though no time had passed at all. "Elira, stay inside," Jethro's voice rang out, his gaze flicking toward her window. But Elira didn't stay inside. She couldn't. She had been raised in the shadow of her father's past, and she had trained for this moment. Her instincts screamed at her to stay back, to let her father fight alone. But her heart refused to obey. She moved toward the door, her hand gripping the sword her father had given her. The weight of it in her hand felt right, steady, strong. As she stepped outside, her father glanced at her, his eyes fierce with a mix of pride and warning. "No, Elira," he called, his voice commanding. "Stay back." But Elira didn't hesitate. She wasn't a child anymore. She was ready. She could feel the training her father had instilled in her, the lessons she had fought so hard to learn. She stepped forward, positioning herself beside him, her sword raised. "I'm not running, father," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "I'm not hiding anymore." Her father didn't say anything, but his gaze softened for just a moment. There was a flicker of approval in his eyes before he turned his attention back to the fight. The leader, seeing Elira join the fray, snarled in fury. "You think you can protect her, Jethro? You've made a mistake coming back. There's no place for men like you anymore." But Jethro didn't flinch. He moved with the same confidence, the same deadly precision. And this time, with Elira at his side, the battle was no longer one-sided. Together, they cut down the remaining outlaws with ruthless efficiency. Her father's strength, her own speed, combined, they were a force that no one could withstand. The leader's arrogance melted away as he realized he was surrounded. He took a step back, his eyes wild with desperation. But it was too late. Jethro was upon him in an instant, his sword flashing in a blinding arc. With a final, decisive strike, the leader fell. The fight was over. The silence that followed was deafening. The air hung heavy, charged with the energy of the battle that had just unfolded. Elira stood beside her father, her chest heaving with exertion, her sword still raised. The outlaws were defeated, their bodies scattered across the docks. The battle was over, but Elira knew that this was only the beginning. Her father, though covered in sweat and dust, was still standing tall, his face a mask of quiet determination. He turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. "This isn't over, Elira," he said, his voice steady but filled with an unspoken warning. "They will come again. We have to be ready." Elira nodded, her heart steady now, the fear replaced by a deep, unwavering resolve. She wasn't the child she once was. She was ready to fight, ready to stand with her father, no matter what came next. And whatever came, they would face it together. The sun sank low behind the mountains, casting an eerie red glow across the village. The wind had picked up, rustling the trees and carrying with it the unmistakable scent of the sea. The docks, once quiet and serene, were now littered with the fallen bodies of the outlaws. The remnants of the battle, the bloodied soil, the discarded weapons, told a story of a fight fought not just for survival, but for something more, something deeper. Elira stood beside her father, her sword now sheathed at her side, though her body still trembled from the intensity of the battle. She could hear the quiet murmurs of the villagers in the distance, soft voices filled with awe and fear. The victory was theirs, but it had come at a cost. The outlaws were gone, but Elira knew the truth. This was not the end. It was only the beginning. "Father," Elira said, her voice steady but laced with unease. "What happens now?" Jethro stood in silence, his gaze fixed on the horizon. His posture was straight, but there was a weariness in the lines of his face. an exhaustion that went beyond the battle they had just fought. He had known this day would come. He had known that, no matter how hard he had tried to leave it all behind, his past would always catch up to him. And now, the Outlaw's arrival was only the first of many threats. She could see it in the way he held himself, in the way his eyes scanned the distant shoreline, as if searching for something or someone. "They'll be back," Jethro said finally, his voice low but filled with a certain grim certainty. "They're just the first wave. The rebellion is bigger than this. We've only seen a fraction of what's coming." Elira's heart sank at the words. The rebellion. She had heard whispers of it from the villagers, the unrest spreading through the kingdom, the rise of factions seeking to tear apart the fragile peace that had once held the land together. She had never understood the depth of it. She had never wanted to. But now, standing here, she realized that they were at the center of something much larger than her father's past, something far beyond the quiet life they had built by the sea. "And we're caught in the middle of it," she whispered, her words a mix of realization and dread. Jethro nodded, his face hardening. "There's no escaping it, Elira. They know who I am, and they'll use me, whether I want to be used or not." Elira's stomach tightened. "What do we do?" Jethro turned toward her, his gaze steady. "We prepare. We make sure they don't take what's left of this village, what's left of us." The silence that followed was heavy. Elira didn't speak, but she knew that her father was right. They couldn't run. They couldn't hide. The battle had come to their doorstep, and now they had no choice but to face it head-on. Later that evening, as the village settled into uneasy quiet, Elira and her father began to make their plans. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices carrying the weight of the future. The village had always been a place of peace, a place of refuge. But now, it was a battleground. And in the days to come, Elira would learn more about her father's past, the things he had done, the things he had left behind, than she had ever wanted to know. As night fell, Jethro led Elira to the edge of the village, where a small cliff overlooked the ocean. The wind whipped around them, carrying with it the salt of the sea. Elira stood beside her father, her thoughts swirling in a haze of confusion and fear. "They'll come," Jethro said again, his voice barely audible over the wind. "And when they do, we'll be ready." Elira turned to face him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt. But there was none. His expression was hard, unyielding. He was the man who had fought wars for kings, the man who had held his ground in the face of impossible odds. And now, he would fight again. For her, for the village, for everything they had left. "Father," Elira said, her voice low but full of determination. "I'm ready. I won't run." Jethro looked at her, his eyes softening, but only for a moment. There was pride there, but also a deep sadness, as though he understood the weight of the decision they were making. "I know you are," he replied, "but you must remember, this is not a game. This is real. This is life or death. And once we start down this road, there's no turning back." Elira nodded. She had known this all along, had felt it in her bones. The life they had once known, peaceful, quiet, and free, was gone. They had stepped into a world of violence, of war, and there was no escaping it. She took a deep breath, her resolve firming with every passing moment. "Then we face it together." Her father's lips curled into a faint smile, the first sign of warmth Elira had seen from him in days. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch heavy but comforting. "Yes," he said quietly. "Together." The next morning, Elira and Jethro spent the day preparing. They sharpened blades, fortified their small cottage, and gathered the few supplies they could carry. The villagers, though wary, knew what was coming. They saw the change in Jethro, the way he carried himself, the way his eyes no longer held the softness of the fisherman, but the steely resolve of the warrior. By evening, the preparations were complete. There was nothing more they could do. They could only wait. And as the sun sank below the horizon, casting long shadows across the sea, Elira felt the weight of the coming storm settle over her. She knew it wasn't just her father's past that was at stake. It was everything they had built together. The village, her home, her life. And when the rebellion came, they would face it, not as a father and daughter hiding from the past, but as warriors ready to protect everything they held dear. The days following their preparations were a blur of quiet tension. Elira could feel the weight of the impending danger with each passing moment. The air itself seemed thick with it. The village, once so full of life, was now an uneasy place. Even the simplest of tasks, mending nets, gathering wood for the fire, felt like something more now. Each movement, every glance, carried the expectation of something coming. The villagers worked, but there was no joy in it. The fear hung in the air like a cloud that wouldn't dissipate. Jethro had kept mostly to himself, retreating into the small, modest cabin they called home. He spent hours each day sharpening his sword, checking his armor, and working through plans that Elira knew he would never speak aloud. He had lived a life of combat, of kingdoms at war, and Elira could see that the memories of it all weighed heavily on him now. The soft-spoken fisherman she had known for years had once been a man of incredible power, a swordsman who had faced the greatest battles the kingdom had ever known. And that man was coming to the surface once again. One night, as the village settled into its uneasy slumber, Elira sat on the edge of their front porch, staring out at the dark sea. The moon was a thin crescent, barely a sliver in the sky, and the waves broke against the rocks with a distant, haunting rhythm. Everything felt strangely still, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The wind had calmed, but there was an edge to it now, as though it carried with it a warning. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know it was her father. She had always known when he was near, even when he hadn't spoken a word. "Father," Elira said quietly, her voice barely more than a whisper against the quiet night. Jethro didn't answer immediately. He stepped up beside her, his silhouette dark against the night sky, and stood there, staring out at the sea as she had been. There was a long pause, a silence between them that stretched on as if they were both trying to understand something deeper than words could convey. "We're ready," Elira said after a moment, her voice firm, though a part of her heart still quivered with uncertainty. She was ready to face whatever came, but there was no denying the fear that had taken root inside her. The fear that her life, and her father's, was about to change forever. Jethro turned his head slightly, his eyes scanning the horizon, as though he could sense something out there in the distance. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and measured, filled with a weight that matched the darkness of the world around them. "It's not just about being ready, Elira," he said quietly. "It's about surviving what comes next. We can't hide from it. We can't outrun it." Elira nodded, feeling the gravity of his words. "What happens when they come?" Her father's eyes flicked to her, and for a moment, she saw something there. A flicker of something almost like regret, but it was gone too quickly to be sure. He stepped forward, a slow, deliberate movement, and placed his hand on her shoulder. His grip was firm, but there was something in it that made her feel grounded, as though no matter what happened, he would protect her. "We fight," Jethro said, his voice resolute, but filled with the kind of sorrow only a man who had lived through endless battles could carry. "We fight, and we protect what we have left." Elira stared out at the sea, her chest tight with the weight of everything they had built, everything they had lost. The village, the quiet life she had known, was slipping away, irretrievably altered by the forces closing in around them. And yet, despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, she knew there was no other choice. She couldn't turn away. She couldn't hide. The night passed in silence, but sleep never came. Elira lay awake in her bed, the sounds of the ocean lulling her into a restless half-sleep, her thoughts a constant churn of fear and resolve. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "We fight, and we protect." The next morning, the world felt heavier. The air was thick with anticipation. The villagers had begun to talk more openly now, though there was an undercurrent of unease in every conversation. The preparations had been made. The barricades were up. The weapons had been sharpened. And now, it was only a matter of time. It wasn't long before Elira and her father were standing side by side once more, just outside the village, their eyes fixed on the road that led in from the east. The riders had come in the night, a small group, too small to be the force they feared, but dangerous all the same. Elira could see them now, their cloaks dark against the morning sky, riding steadily toward the village. Jethro's eyes narrowed, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his sword. His body was tense, poised for action. Elira stood beside him, her sword in her hand, her stance steady but her heart pounding in her chest. "They've come," she said, her voice barely a whisper, the words carrying more weight than they should have. "They've come," her father repeated, his voice low, filled with a quiet, unwavering strength. "And we will be ready." The outlaws rode closer, their horses' hooves kicking up dust as they approached the village. There was no fear in their eyes, only hunger, the promise of violence waiting to be unleashed. And Elira knew that the calm of the village had been shattered forever. The storm was here, and there would be no turning back. The leader of the riders, tall, broad-shouldered, and with a cruel sneer on his face, dismounted as he reached the edge of the village. His men followed suit, their eyes scanning the surroundings with an unsettling calm. The leader's gaze fell on Elira and her father, lingering for a moment longer on Jethro. His smirk widened. "You," he said, his voice cold and mocking. "The man who vanished. The fisherman. The king's guard." Jethro's expression never wavered. "I'm not your enemy," he said, his voice calm but full of something far more dangerous than anger. "But if you come for my daughter, if you come for my home, you will be—" The leader laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that carried across the village. "We're not here to negotiate, Jethro. We're here to take what's ours. And we'll start with you." Elira felt a surge of rage, but she didn't move. This wasn't her fight, not yet, but she would be ready when it was. She could see her father's hand tightening around the hilt of his sword, could feel the tension building between them, the inevitability of what was about to happen. The battle was upon them. The leader of the outlaws stood there, his sword drawn, his eyes cold and filled with an unrelenting hunger. The rest of his men fanned out behind him, their expressions matching his own, fierce but calculating. Elira could feel the weight of their presence like a physical pressure, as though the entire village held its breath, waiting for the first move. Her father, Jethro, stood beside her, the grip on his sword steady and unflinching. The years of battle had not left him. His movements were deliberate, precise. The outlaws may have had numbers on their side, but they had underestimated him. They had underestimated them both. "I've warned you," Jethro said, his voice calm, but filled with an icy promise. "Leave now, and I won't be forced to end this." The leader scoffed, his eyes narrowing as he stepped forward, his sword raised in a threatening gesture. "And this? You're in no position to make threats, old man. You've hidden away for too long. It's time the kingdom remembers who you were." The words cut through Elira, and for a moment, she felt something stir within her, a deep, primal anger. She had never seen her father as the warrior he once was, had never understood the depth of his past, the blood he had spilled in the name of the crown. But in that moment, with the outlaws surrounding them, the truth was undeniable. Her father was no mere fisherman. He was a man forged in the fires of war, a man who had once held the kingdom's future in his hands. The leader took another step forward, his men following suit. But before he could move again, Jethro acted. In a flash, he unsheathed his sword, and the world seemed to slow. The sound of steel cutting through the air was deafening, and the leader's sword was knocked from his hands with a swift strike. The outlaws froze for a moment, stunned by the speed and force of the attack. Jethro stood tall, his blade gleaming in the early morning light, his expression one of unflinching resolve. "You made the wrong choice," Jethro said quietly, his eyes cold as ice. "You should have turned around." Without a word, the first outlaw lunged at him. But Jethro was already moving, his sword sweeping through the air, cutting down the man before he had even reached him. The sound of the blade meeting flesh was sickening, and the outlaw fell to the ground, his lifeblood spilling across the dirt. Elira felt a cold wave of fear wash over her, but there was no time for hesitation. Her father was moving through them like a storm, each strike calculated, every movement perfect. The outlaw's arrogance was quickly fading, replaced by the realization that they were in the presence of someone far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The leader stumbled back, his eyes wild with disbelief. "You," he spat, his voice filled with rage and fear. "You're supposed to be a relic, a ghost. What are you?" Jethro didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, his blade flashing once more. Another outlaw fell, and then another. His movements were flawless, swift, deadly, and without mercy. Elira had never seen him like this before. It wasn't just his skill. It was the raw power behind each swing, the sheer ferocity of a man who had once fought in battles that had shaped the kingdom. He was a warrior at his core, and the battle had awakened something within him that Elira couldn't deny. But even as her father fought, Elira felt the fear rise in her chest. This wasn't just a fight to defend their village anymore. This was a fight for survival. And though Jethro was unstoppable, she could see the outlaws closing in. The numbers were too great. The battle was too uneven. "Elira," Jethro's voice cut through the chaos, his tone sharp. "Stay back. You're not ready." But Elira didn't stay back. She couldn't. She had spent too many days learning the sword, too many hours preparing for this moment. She was ready. She knew she was. Her father couldn't fight this alone, and though the fear still gripped her, there was something stronger, something more fierce, pushing her forward. She moved toward him, her sword in hand, her steps steady despite the growing panic in her chest. The outlaws saw her approach, and the leader sneered. "The fisherman's daughter," he mocked. "You think you can stop us, girl?" Elira didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. With a swift movement, she swung her blade, catching the closest outlaw off guard. The blade hit its mark, and the man crumpled to the ground, his eyes wide with shock. For a moment, there was silence, a brief, suspended moment when the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, the battle continued. The outlaws realized they had underestimated her, just as they had underestimated her father. They turned toward her with renewed fury, but Elira didn't back down. She stood her ground, her sword flashing with every strike, her movements growing bolder as she found her rhythm. Her father fought beside her, his blade unstoppable, cutting down anyone who dared to challenge him. The leader's eyes flicked toward Elira again, and he snarled. "You'll regret this, girl," he hissed. "You'll both regret this." But Jethro stepped forward, his sword raised. "You've already lost." The final confrontation happened in the span of seconds. The leader charged, his sword raised high, but Jethro was faster. He sidestepped the attack, his blade cutting through the air with a force that could only come from a lifetime of battle. In one swift, powerful motion, Jethro disarmed the leader, his sword knocking from his hands and sending him sprawling to the ground. The leader's face twisted in pain and fury, but Jethro stood over him, his sword poised. For a moment, the world seemed to hold still. The leader's breath came in ragged gasps, his eyes full of defiance, but also fear. "Elira," Jethro said softly, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Finish it." The weight of the words hung in the air. Elira looked down at the leader, her heart pounding in her chest. She had trained for this. She had prepared for this moment. And yet, standing here, with the life of a man in her hands, she felt the weight of it all. But there was no choice. She couldn't hesitate. With a swift, decisive motion, Elira brought the sword down. The leader's life was extinguished in an instant. The silence that followed was deafening. The battle was over. The outlaws were defeated. Elira stood, her chest rising and falling with every breath, her sword heavy in her hands. Her father stood beside her, his eyes filled with pride and something else, something deeper. "We're not finished yet," Jethro said, his voice low. "This was only a taste. The kingdom is broken, Elira, and there will be more." Elira nodded, her grip tightening around the sword. She had never been more certain of anything in her life. This was just the beginning. They would face whatever came next. Together. The morning after the battle, the village was eerily quiet. The air, once thick with the sound of clashing swords and the cries of the fallen, had settled into a heavy silence. The bloodshed was over, but the cost of it lingered. Bodies lay scattered across the docks, the remains of the outlaws who had come to take everything. The villagers, who had witnessed the fight from a distance, began to emerge from their homes, their faces filled with a mixture of awe and fear. Elira stood at the edge of the docks, her sword still in her hand, her breath slow and deliberate as she looked out at the scene before her. The village, which had once felt so safe, so secure, now felt exposed. It was no longer the peaceful haven it had been. The outlaws' attack had been a reminder that the world outside had caught up to them, and nothing would ever be the same again. Beside her, Jethro moved silently, his eyes scanning the wreckage. The battle had been brutal, but it was far from over. The outlaws were only the first wave. There would be more, and they would come with greater force. Elira knew this. Her father had taught her that. But standing here now, surrounded by the aftermath of violence, she couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. "Father," Elira began, her voice tentative, unsure. "What happens now?" Jethro didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained focused on the fallen bodies, the chaos they had wrought. His expression was unreadable, his face hard, but there was something in his eyes, a weariness that Elira hadn't seen before. It was the look of a man who had fought too many battles, who had faced too many enemies. It was the look of someone who knew that peace was a fleeting illusion, something that could be shattered in an instant. "They will come," Jethro said finally, his voice low and filled with grim certainty. "We're not finished here. This is only the beginning." Elira nodded, though she didn't fully understand. She had seen her father fight, had felt the power and precision of his sword, but she had never truly grasped the depths of the world he had come from. The world of kings and armies, of bloodshed and betrayal. She had only heard the stories, whispered by the villagers when they thought she wasn't listening. But now, standing in the aftermath of this battle, she understood. The past had caught up with them, and there was no escaping it. "We need to gather what we can," Jethro said, his voice taking on a more practical tone. "Food, water, supplies. The village will need to be fortified. The next attack could come at any moment." Elira nodded, her mind already shifting into action. She could feel the urgency in her father's words. They needed to prepare. They needed to be ready. There was no time for fear, no time for hesitation. She had been trained for this. She had learned how to fight, how to defend, how to survive. But now, as the village around her began to stir, as the villagers began to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, Elira realized that this fight was no longer just about her and her father. It was about everyone. It was about survival. And survival meant more than just fighting. It meant protecting what little they had left. As they gathered the villagers and began to prepare for the coming storm, Elira's thoughts wandered back to the battle, to the faces of the outlaws, the men who had come for them, who had underestimated her father. She had fought alongside him, had seen him move with the precision and speed of a true warrior. But even as she had fought, there had been a part of her that had wondered, how much longer could they keep this up? How many battles would it take before the world finally caught up with them? The villagers worked quickly, reinforcing the walls of their homes, securing the few remaining supplies they had left. There was a sense of urgency in the air, a shared understanding that the peace they had once known was gone. The fight had come for them, and they would have to fight back. Elira's hands trembled as she worked, but she pushed through the fear, the doubt, and the exhaustion. Her father had taught her how to fight, how to survive. But now, she was learning something even more important: how to lead, how to protect. The weight of it all was heavy, but she didn't back down. She couldn't. Not now. Not when everything they had worked for was at stake. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the village, Elira and her father stood together at the edge of the docks, their eyes scanning the horizon. The night was quiet, but the air was thick with the sense of something more waiting, something darker. Elira could feel it, deep in her bones. The outlaws had been the first wave, but they wouldn't be the last. They were coming. The rebellion was coming, and the kingdom was falling apart. "We're ready," Elira said, her voice steady despite the fear that still gripped her. She had never been more certain of anything in her life. She had trained for this. She had prepared for this. And whatever came next, she would face it. Jethro nodded, his eyes narrowing as he watched the horizon. Ready or not, they're coming. The wind picked up again, carrying with it the scent of the ocean, the promise of something far greater than they had prepared for. Elira stood tall, her sword in hand, her heart steady. Together, they would face whatever came next. Together, they would fight. The night felt heavy, filled with an unsettling stillness. Elira lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind that rattled the shutters, felt like a prelude to something worse. It wasn't just the quiet that unsettled her. It was the anticipation of what was to come. Her father had warned her, and she had seen enough to know that the next attack was inevitable. The outlaws had shown their hand, but they were only a part of something much larger. The rebellion, the whispers of a fractured kingdom. It was all closing in on them. She could hear her father's voice in her mind, the steady command in his tone when he had told her to be ready, to prepare. But even with all the training, all the preparations they had made, Elira still felt a sense of unease that gnawed at her insides. It was the waiting that was the hardest part, the knowledge that they couldn't hide from what was coming. And it was coming fast. The next morning dawned gray and overcast. The sea, usually a calming sight, now felt foreboding, its waves crashing against the shore with a violent, rhythmic force. Elira and her father had barely exchanged words, but the silence between them spoke volumes. There was no need for more training now. There was no more time. They had done what they could. All they could do now was wait and fight when the time came. Elira stood by the docks, her sword resting at her side, her fingers lightly brushing the hilt. The villagers were working to fortify their homes, reinforcing the gates, checking the walls. They knew what was coming. There was no denying it anymore. The rebellion was not just a rumor. It was real, and it was closing in on them. Her father joined her at the edge of the docks, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his posture rigid, as if every muscle in his body was prepared for whatever came next. He had always been a man of action, of quiet resolve, but Elira could see the weariness in him now. The weight of what they were about to face hung over him, too. "Father," Elira said, her voice quiet but firm, "what do we do if they come in greater numbers? What if they bring more than just the outlaws?" Jethro turned to her, his expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Something that spoke of experience, of battles fought long ago. He didn't hesitate before answering. "We fight," he said simply, his voice low but filled with the quiet power that she had always known him for. "We fight with everything we have. And if we have to make our stand here, we make it here." Elira nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She was ready, or at least she thought she was. But the uncertainty of it all, the unknown, lingered like a cloud, blocking out any hope of peace. She had learned to fight, to stand tall, but now she understood that it wasn't just about survival. It was about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The village, her people, the home she had grown up in. It was all at risk, and it was her responsibility, as much as it was her father's, to ensure it wasn't lost. The morning stretched into the afternoon, and as the day wore on, the village grew more tense. There were no signs of movement from the east, no sound of hooves on the road, but Elira could feel it in the pit of her stomach. The calm was unnatural. Every moment of silence felt like a countdown. They were coming, and it wouldn't be long before they were on their doorstep. As the evening sun began to set, casting an amber glow across the sea, Elira and her father stood at the edge of the village, watching the horizon. The shadows grew longer, and the air felt thick with the weight of what was about to happen. There was a strange sense of finality to the moment, a feeling that everything they had done up until now had been building to this. "We should go inside," Elira said quietly, her voice filled with an unease she couldn't shake. She had learned to prepare for battle, but there was a part of her that still longed for the quiet days of fishing, of peaceful mornings spent by the sea. But Jethro shook his head, his eyes still fixed on the distance. "No, we stand our ground here. When they come, we'll be ready." Elira didn't argue. She had learned that when her father made a decision, it was final. But she felt the weight of his words settle in her chest. They had already decided that they wouldn't run. There would be no retreat. This was their fight, and it was one they couldn't back away from. The night fell, and the village seemed to hold its breath. Elira lay in bed, her sword beside her, her body tense, her mind racing. She listened to the quiet sounds of the night, the distant crash of waves, the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. But the longer she lay there, the more the silence seemed to stretch on. It was unnatural, oppressive. She knew they were coming. Around midnight, the sound of hooves broke the silence. A rhythmic pounding, growing closer with each passing moment. Elira's heart jumped in her chest, and she quickly rose from the bed, her hand instinctively reaching for the sword. She could hear her father's footsteps behind her, his presence steady and calm. There was no fear in him, only the resolve of a man who had been preparing for this moment for years. "We're ready," Jethro said quietly as he reached her side. Elira nodded, her breath coming in sharp, steady gasps. "Then let's end it." The sound of the horses grew louder, closer now, the thundering hooves signaling the arrival of what they had been preparing for. The rebellion had come to their doorstep, and now there would be no turning back. Her father moved first, stepping out into the night, his sword gleaming under the dim light of the moon. Elira followed, her body steady, her mind focused. She had prepared for this moment, and now it was time to face it. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And they would fight until the last breath. The sound of hooves was unmistakable, growing louder with every second, reverberating through the very earth beneath their feet. The village, now eerily quiet save for the pounding of the horses' hooves, felt as if it was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable clash. Elira stood at her father's side, her sword gripped tightly in her hand, her muscles coiled like a spring ready to release. She could feel the anticipation in the air, the weight of what was about to unfold pressing against her chest. The moon hung high in the sky, casting long, jagged shadows across the docks, and in that pale light, Elira could see her father's face, set in stone, his expression unreadable. He was the same man who had once stood as the king's blade, but there was something more now, something primal in the way he moved, in the way he held himself. The years of peace had not dulled him. If anything, they had sharpened his instincts, prepared him for this moment. "Stay close," Jethro muttered, his voice low and filled with a quiet authority. "When they arrive, don't let them get close." Elira nodded, her throat tight, but her mind was sharp. She had trained for this, and she knew her father's methods, his movements, his tactics. She had learned from the best, and now she would have to prove that she was ready. Her hand rested on the hilt of her sword, the familiar weight of it steadying her nerves. They had worked for this moment, prepared for it. But as the sounds of approaching riders reached their peak, a new, frightening realization settled in her gut. The leader of the Outlaws had been only the first wave. The true force of the rebellion had yet to show itself. The first of the riders broke through the tree line, their horses kicking up the earth, and Elira could see them clearly now. Figures clad in dark armor, their faces hidden beneath hoods. A dozen riders, no more, were galloping toward the village, their movements synchronized, deliberate. These were not mere bandits. These were soldiers, trained and ruthless. The night air crackled with tension as the first rider reined in his horse before them. He wore no insignia, no markings to identify him, but there was a cold confidence in his posture, in the way he looked at them, as if he had already won. "We come for Jethro," the man called out, his voice carrying across the quiet village. His words were heavy with disdain, his eyes cold and calculating. "The king's sword has no place in this world anymore. You will either surrender, or we will take what is ours." Elira's grip on her sword tightened. Her father didn't flinch. He stood tall, his sword at his side, unwavering. "I've given up nothing," Jethro replied, his voice calm but filled with an unmistakable fury. "You've come too far, and you've made a grave mistake." The rider sneered, then signaled to the others. With a sharp motion, they charged forward, their swords raised. The clattering of hooves and the roar of battle filled the air, and in that instant, everything Elira had trained for came to life. Her father moved first, his sword flashing like lightning. Elira followed close behind, her feet steady, her body moving fluidly with the battle, her sword slicing through the air with precision. The first rider reached them, his sword raised high, but Elira was faster. She stepped to the side, her sword knocking his aside before she brought the blade down, striking with swift efficiency. The rider crumpled to the ground, his body limp as Elira swiftly moved to the next. The battle erupted around them, and Elira was swept into it, her movements instinctive, her focus unwavering. Her father fought beside her, his blade flashing, cutting down the rebels with the quiet fury of a man who had seen it all, who had faced armies and kings. His strikes were like the wind, unstoppable, efficient, and without mercy. Elira could hear the cries of the fallen, the clatter of armor, the screech of steel meeting steel. The rebels were relentless, charging with the full weight of their numbers. But her father's strength was undeniable. Elira had seen him in battle before, but this was something else. He was no longer just a man. He was a force of nature, a storm that had come to answer the rebellion's challenge. But even as they cut down the rebels before them, Elira knew it wasn't enough. More riders kept coming, their numbers growing with every passing moment. They were relentless, and as the battle raged on, the village grew smaller and smaller in her mind. The fear, while ever present, was slowly being replaced by something else, something deeper. The second wave of rebels charged forward, their faces determined, their weapons gleaming in the moonlight. Elira's heart pounded in her chest as she met their gaze. She was no longer just fighting for her father. She was fighting for the village, for everything they had worked to protect. "Father," she called, her voice cutting through the chaos. "We need to fall back. There are too many." Jethro didn't answer immediately. His gaze locked on her for a moment, and then he nodded. "Fall back to the town square," he commanded, his voice steady and sure. "We'll hold them there." Together, they cut a path through the enemy lines, their swords flashing as they fought their way toward the heart of the village. The rebels followed them, pushing forward, but Elira could feel the shift in the battle. Her father was leading them, leading her, through it all. He was a force of nature, unrelenting in his determination. The town square came into view, the familiar buildings now shrouded in shadows. But it wasn't just the buildings that caught Elira's attention. The villagers, those who had been hidden in their homes, who had been preparing for this day, were gathering in the square, their faces filled with a mix of fear and determination. They had seen their homes threatened, their lives shattered by the rebellion's arrival. But now, they were ready to fight. Elira stood beside her father, her sword raised, her body ready. The villagers, though they were not soldiers, had gathered their courage. Together, they stood against the tide of rebels, refusing to give up without a fight. "We will not surrender," Jethro said, his voice carrying across the square. "This is our home, and we will protect it." The rebels paused, their eyes flicking between Elira, her father, and the villagers. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, without warning, the battle continued, the rebels charging forward once again, eager to claim what they thought was rightfully theirs. But this time, the villagers fought back, and Elira stood beside them, her sword flashing in the moonlight, her heart full of resolve. This was no longer just about survival. It was about defending everything they had left. And together, they would fight. The air was thick with the sound of clashing swords and cries of desperation. The town square had become a battleground, a place where the last remnants of peace were now being torn apart. Elira stood with her father, shoulder to shoulder, surrounded by the villagers who had gathered to make their final stand. The rebels, relentless and merciless, had thought they could overrun the village without much resistance. But they had underestimated the people of this place, the men and women who had lived here their whole lives, who had seen the beauty of the ocean, who had known only peace until now. They were not fighters by nature, but when their homes were threatened, they became something else. Jethro's sword gleamed in the moonlight, each strike delivered with precision, each movement a testament to years of battle. Elira moved beside him, her own sword raised, her stance steady and confident. She had grown from the girl who had once worked the docks, casting nets and mending ropes. Now, she was a warrior, standing alongside her father, facing down the enemy with everything she had. The rebels charged, a sea of men and women driven by greed and fury, their weapons raised, their faces masked by shadows. They did not see the villagers standing ready, eyes filled with defiance, hands gripping whatever they could find to fight. The villagers were not soldiers, but they were fighting for their homes, their families, and for the future they had dreamed of. Elira's heart pounded in her chest as she fought, each swing of her sword sending another enemy to the ground. Her movements were fluid now, natural, as though the blade had become a part of her. She could hear her father's voice in her ear, steady and calm despite the chaos around them. He was always in control, always ahead of the battle, always thinking. His presence beside her gave her strength, and she fought with the same unyielding resolve that he did. The town square had become a blur of bodies and blood, the air thick with the metallic scent of iron. Elira's breath was shallow, her arms tired from the exertion, but she refused to stop. She couldn't, not when everything she loved was on the line. The leader of the rebels, the man who had taunted her father only hours before, was at the forefront of the battle, a hulking figure who seemed to revel in the chaos. His sword was raised high, his eyes locked on Jethro with a look of hatred, a deep desire to defeat the man he had come to claim. "You think you can stop this?" the leader bellowed, his voice booming above the din of battle. "You're just a shadow of the man you once were, Jethro. You can't fight forever. The kingdom belongs to us now." Jethro's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on his sword. His body moved with fluid grace, cutting through the rebel ranks, making his way toward the leader with purpose. Elira could see the shift in her father. He was no longer just defending. He was hunting. "You don't understand," Jethro called back, his voice calm but filled with the weight of years spent fighting for something greater. "This kingdom was built on more than just power. It was built on honor. And you've forgotten that," the leader snarled, his sword crashing down toward Jethro with all the force he could muster. But Jethro was faster. In one swift motion, he deflected the blow, his own sword flashing in the moonlight. The leader stumbled, caught off guard by the sheer speed of the attack. But before he could regain his footing, Jethro was upon him. Elira watched as her father moved, his blade flashing like lightning, each strike a masterful display of control and skill. The leader tried to block, but he was outmatched. Jethro's sword found its mark, and the leader's weapon was knocked from his hands, his body thrown to the ground with a finality that echoed through the square. The rebels paused for a moment, stunned by the fall of their leader. But there was no time for hesitation. The villagers, spurred on by the sight of their protector standing tall, pressed forward with renewed fury. They fought as one, pushing back the invaders, refusing to let their home be taken. Elira's heart was heavy as she swung her sword again, taking down another rebel who had dared approach. The fear she had felt earlier was now replaced by something else, something stronger. This wasn't just about defending a village anymore. This was about standing for what was right, for what they had fought for. As the last of the rebels were defeated, the square fell silent. The wind carried the sounds of battle away, and for a brief, fleeting moment, there was nothing but the soft rustling of leaves and the distant crash of the ocean against the shore. Elira stood in the center of the square, her sword at her side, her breath heavy in her chest. Her arms ached, her body sore, but there was no time to rest. She could see the faces of the villagers, some relieved, others still in shock. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. Jethro stepped beside her, his face grim, his eyes scanning the square. "This isn't over, Elira," he said softly, his voice heavy with the weight of truth. "The kingdom is fractured, and the rebellion won't stop. Not now." Elira nodded, her heart heavy with the knowledge that their fight was far from over. But as she looked around at the villagers, at the people who had stood beside them, who had fought for their homes, she knew they had won something more than just a battle. They had fought for their lives, and they had proved that no matter what the enemy threw at them, they would not back down. Together, they had defended everything they held dear, and together, they would continue to fight. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.